And we're live. Good day, whiskey brothers and whiskey sisters, and welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's 10th book review and the second edition of Whiskey Island, A Portrait of Islay and Its Whiskies by author Andrew Jefford. As always, we're honored to have you, the viewer, and Andrew has got his own book. That's good. You, the viewer, and our panel here with us today. My name's Dolph. I'm the founder of the Whiskey Book Club. I'm your host tonight. And for those of you that are new to us, I'll explain just a wee bit of what we're about. One, we're a bunch of whiskey geeks that love to share a dram. And two, share our passion of reading, mostly of or about whiskey or whiskey-related activities. There's other alcohol book clubs out there now, but none of them, and I say none, that delve so deeply into the topic with the author, this guy right here, this gentleman, than we do. And I said this last week, but it bears repeating. I'm really excited to have this author with us, right there. Andrew, author of Whiskey Island, previously Peat, Smoke and Spirit in 2004, accomplished journalist, consultant, lecturer, tasting judge, guide, and author to 15 other books. And we are so happy to have him here with us today. You know what? I think I have the list of the 15 books below, but if not, I'm going to put that on the site below for YouTube. Let's start it all off. The introductions with your names, your other platform handles, and what's in your glasses and why you chose that. And we're going to go alphabetically. So we'll do Dave, Kent, Nick, and Val. And I just need to say a special thank you to Val. It's her first time on the panel, and we're really happy to have you. And you'll introduce yourself in a second. And then we'll finish off with Andrew, and then we'll start the gambit of questions that I'm just going to be throwing out there. So, Dave, let's start with you, buddy.
All right. Hey, good afternoon. It's Yukon Dave coming from his basement, as always. I'm drinking the Bowmore 12. I found this mini bottle last week, and I thought I needed my glasses because I wasn't sure why it was so small, but it was a good buy. So
and that's quite the pour you've got there as well.
Well, it's got to last for at least the first hour.
That's not enough.
And if that doesn't last an hour, well, it will, I'm sure. Kent, you're up, buddy.
Hi, my name's Kent. I go by Whiskey Ass on pretty much all platforms, and I pulled this little dusty out of my closet. It's a small batch, release number 3, and it's a 10-year-old. And I have quite a few Bowmores, so I was going back and forth tonight trying to figure out, well, this afternoon, figure out what the heck I wanted to drink.
I think the Murray McDavid should be brought out as well. I like that one. I think
I do also have
there you go. You should bring that out too. Another 10-year-old. We're good.
Another 10-year-old.
You're up.
Hey everyone, I'm Nick. I go by Black Cat Whiskey. I've pulled a bottle, and it's Vault Edition number 1. I will not be drinking it today. I have some driving to do afterwards, so I will be nursing my tea for our session.
Or tea in a whiskey cup is what we should say.
Yes.
Val, you're up.
Thank you. I wasn't aware that we were supposed to pull basically the legendary Bowmore dram. I do have a Bowmore. I don't know if you can see it here. Hang on. Let me get my head out of the way. I never know which way to go. So I've got the darkest up there. I used to actually rep for Bowmore. Ooh. And so I've had a chance to taste everything. But like Nick, I've got whiskey in a coffee cup. And this is actually my last pour of an Islay whiskey called Lefroy with some Drambuie. I happen to love rusty nails.
Ooh, that's my drink, Val. You're dear to me so much. And darkest is my favorite Bowmore of all time. So I'm really envious of what's right behind your head. Thank you for coming on with us, Val. This is fun. And our author, the man of the hour, Mr. Jefford.
Yeah, great to be with you all. Okay, so hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Jefford. You've, well, you probably all know who I am if you're watching this. I'm down here in the south of France, so it's evening time, so I have got a dram. I tell you what, I'm really jealous of all your collections I can see in the background, particularly Kent. He seems to have a kind of complete room behind him stuffed with exotic whiskies. I don't really have that. I just have, you know, a few whiskies down here. I don't have a huge collection. So like Val, this is a glass of Lefroy. Okay, I'll get rid of that phone. I'll just go and get rid of that phone so it doesn't bother us again.
Yeah. You know, that's kind of the the opening to every Zoom or every conference, make sure your electronics are on silent.
And we do that. And I'm a teacher, and I do the same thing with my students, no matter how young they are. They could be 12, 13, 14. It's like, turn off the phones. We're going to start. Andrew, you might not have the collection that we do with some whiskeys, but I'm sure your wine collection is astronomical.
Well, it isn't astronomical. I have. It's really a working collection, I would say. It's I have what I have, to get on with my work, but I don't have any fantastic collection. I'm not particularly a collector. I'm super interested in the subject in its biggest sense. And obviously, I'm very fortunate to have the chance to taste some fantastic things from time to time. You've read the book. You've seen some of the wonderful whiskeys I had a chance to taste during the research for the book. But I have to say, I'm not a collector. I don't have huge resources. I'm just getting on with work and coming across stuff and writing about it when I come across it.
Nice. And I'll introduce myself, I guess, the same thing. And I've got a Bowmore 10. I'm going for the basic, the Bowmore 10. I've got the Scarabus, which is a blend, Isla blend with Bowmore in there. So I'll be doing that in the after dram. I usually have the tallest dram of everyone, but Dave's got me beat. So, and I've got my nice Bowmore.
Oh, nice.
Pick that one out just for the event. Really happy to be here today. So it's noon for us here and 8 o'clock for Andrew, and he could be outside with the dark behind him. We would never know. But panel, Andrew, it's our second book, and you might have noticed this right away, but Andrew starts with the historical battles, the feuds, and the political intrigue again. And we are so lucky to have this again blessed in the book, because I love history. I'm a history major. But I'm wondering, and I'm asking this of everybody, and I'll finish off with Andrew, if I may. Why do we like it so much when we hear about Scotch in particular? We love hearing about the fights, the battles, the clans. Why is that so intricately linked to Scotch? And I'll throw that out to everybody, whoever wants to talk. Yeah, the Kardashian factor. No. It's not cheapened like that. We're better than that. I'm waiting.
I think the history is just, I'm commenting, AKA my wife. She's switching over. The history is kind of neat. I find it interesting that we're all drawn to the stills. Dolph does mention that later on. The copper, it's all shiny. And I think that goes back to being a very easy to work with material, and we're all kind of drawn to it because from our younger days. But the battles and everything, the war, we don't see war like that. We're never exposed to it, so I think it kind of intrigues us. It's a drawback to maybe our caveman days, where we're fighting for dominance and stuff like that. One of the other questions, how do you feel about yourself? Are you the passive or are you the aggressive? And I tend to be aggressive. I know this of myself. So I would be that warlord kind of person back in the day.
And you want to think of your day finishing off with a dram somehow? Oh,
yeah. And honestly, I go back and I think about it, stuff going off the still back then. I don't think it would be good, not compared to what we drink now. I think a lot of it would be very raw, one times through, you go through a stripping still, and that would be, and even before that, people were going blind because they wouldn't realize they need to cut the heads off of it, right? So it's a different time.
I think it's also some of how well marketing has been done on whiskey, and especially on Scottish whiskey. It's this romance, it's the kilt, it's these broadswords, it's intrigue, it's everything, and it's been marketed and it's been sold so well. So you're all intrigued, you're sucked in because you love the story, and we all want a good story.
Yeah,
and it just adds to that story.
Yeah, the romance.
Yeah. Romance, drama. Andrew, is it more about the writer, about an exciting story leading to marketing opportunities later? Is it truly grounded in fact, inseparable from the spirit?
Well, the great thing about alcoholic beverages in general, in fact, this is true of wine, it's true of a lot of other alcoholic beverages too, and certainly it's true of whiskey, is that these are cultural drinks. These are cultural drinks. They're saturated with the culture in which they come into being, as well as being delicious to taste, as well as being intoxicating in their effect, as well as there being mind-altering drugs. So it's this combination of three different things. They soak up culture like a sponge. So what I always find really hard to imagine, although I know, people in hot climates in Singapore and in the Caribbean enjoy a glass of whiskey like anybody else. But to me, a whiskey is so bound up with coldness and bad weather and, drich, what the Scots call drich weather, and, ferocious conditions and endurance and all of that. To me, I always find it hard to imagine drinking and enjoying whiskey in super hot conditions. I find it quite hard down here in the south of France to drink it in the summer, for example, much easier in the winter. But certainly whenever I drink a glass of Scotch, I want to think about Scotland. I want to think about Scottish history. I want to think about the Scottish landscape. Otherwise, I won't enjoy it to the full. We talked a little bit last week about terroir, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again, and what it might mean in whiskey. And to me, it means in whiskey primarily an activity in a place. So when I drink the drink, I think about the activity in the place. That really, for me, is terroir in whiskey. And that's the way I enjoy it the most. That's how I get the most out of it. That's why I wanted to write this book in the first place. That was why I got such a thrill out of researching it. I knew nothing about all of this extraordinary clan history and about the intricate agricultural history of the island. We'll talk about all of these things a bit later in the next couple of hours. But it was a huge learning opportunity for me, and it enriched my experience. So now when I drink a dram of Islay whiskey, all of that is there, and the flavor is much the greater for it.
Nice. And let's say the link. You were talking about the activity, so this kind of leads into another question we had about you. And let's throw a quote up here if I can. Walking right there. So, and you do what I do when I go to a new location. When I go and I'm visiting, the first thing I do is I spend 3 or 4 hours walking aimlessly and into, my wife says, the most horrible of neighborhoods. But it's still how we get to know a place. So your quote, walking, it should be said, is the key which unlocks the door to Mountain Islay. There are no roads here. So this tells us how rustic it is still in some parts of Scotland. It also tells us how you found pearls of information that are woven into the storyline. I think you kind of just alluded to that a little bit. And you do this with the water source in Bowmore a little bit. So can you describe the significance, let's go back to Bowmore, of the canal and maybe what you were looking for on your walkabouts? Or do you even look for something? You just let everything inspire you at that point? Andrew.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do when I researched the book was discover the island physically, intimately. That was very important to me. So one of the things I decided to do with every distillery was go back to the water source and walk from the water source down to the distillery, often accompanied by somebody from the distillery. That's what I did in every case, in fact. So Bowmore is a very interesting one because Bowmore is the least obvious of all of the Islay water sources, of all of the distillery water sources. All of the Kidalton distilleries, all of the lochs are up on a shelf above the coastal strip of Kidalton. So it's perfectly set up. Gravity brings the water down. It's kind of completely natural. There's absolutely nothing natural about Bowmore's water source. It's incredibly complex. It's incredibly difficult. Legendarily, it required a very patient tailor working with waxed thread and drops of water rolling down waxed thread to work out how on earth you could get water from the river miles away through almost very little drop in altitude down to the distillery. And it's still a pretty complicated matter today. And that's why the holding pool next to Bowmore is so important, because that's where the water gathers. That's how the distillery ensures its water supply. So that was a kind of real mark of distinction for Bowmore compared to the other distilleries.
Now, did it remind you of the aqueducts that are more prevalent that we see in southern France and Spain? Is it something like that? Is it at that scope whatsoever.
Yeah, that's quite a nice analogy, Dolph. I hadn't ever thought of that, but yes, I mean there is no aqueduct, but maybe it would make life easier if there was. It is a very complicated and tortuous path from the water source right down to the distillery in Beaumore's case.
And I'm going to throw this to Val, get her involved a little bit. Val, have you been to Islay for one? And because brand ambassador for Beaumore, I'm hoping they brought you there. I hope that's one of the things that they did for you, Val. So your impression of Islay if you went there, and did you go to Beaumore and did you see this canal?
Now, I mentioned that I repped for Beaumore.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was never a brand ambassador. I repped for Beaumore. And that's before it switched over to Suntory, like to Beam Suntory. There was an agency in Canada that was called Severio Shirelli Agencies. And in their portfolio, they had like 40 Creek, they had Auchentoshan, and they had Beaumore. And so this was, a few years back, and things were a little bit different. So no, unfortunately, I've actually never been to Scotland. I started doing a lot of wine travels, but in 2016, I was involved in an airline incident where I suffered a concussion. Ironically, I was knocked out by a drink trolley that had dislodged from its holding place and torpedoed down coach and slammed into my seat in first class, and I was knocked out. And ever since then, I've had a little bit of PTSD about flying. And so I'm hoping maybe someday I'll get over that and get to Scotland. But, at the same time, I think a person has to look at what are they about? What does it mean to them? What does Scotch whiskey mean to them? And for me, yes, I understand completely the importance of visiting the environment and smelling it. And that's my key. It's about aromas. And so for me personally, it's all about the aromas in the glass. And if the aromas are in the glass, do I really need to get the aromas from the countryside? Because I'm interested in actually what is in the glass. Okay. So, I mean, what have you got to say about that? Am I weird for thinking that way? But for me, it's all about the aromas in the glass.
It's lovely, and it's a cheaper way to get yourself to Scotland. But I gotta say, Val, I've been to Scotland once, and it was with my wife, and it was see the ancestral home and the rock quarry that was there. But it was a one-day trip, and I really need a lot more than that. I really do. Plus, I love traveling, and I've never been hit by a drink trolley, so that's a really interesting tidbit that I would have never guessed, no matter what. But we do enjoy, and you know what? Let's bring it back to the walks. When Andrew does he called them water walks. Andrew, did you think of this before? Is this something that you did before you got into the industry? Always take your walk around? I've always done that, but I'm just wondering if you did.
Yeah, well, I love walking. I love walking. I walk at every available opportunity. I love to think while I walk. I love everything about walking. And my ideal holiday would be a very, very long walk. So yeah, wherever I go, I try and walk if I can. I really enjoy that. And obviously Scotland, is a magnificent walking country. It's not always easy walking country because sometimes it gets very wild very quickly. There are no paths. There's lots of bog and marsh and tough walking, and it can get very, very difficult. So you need to do your research first. But Islay is pretty rewarding to walk on, I have to say. Something else we'll come on to in subsequent weeks will be the wildlife of the island, and particularly the birds. And of course, that's a compelling reason for walking all over Islay to see the wonderful bird life you get there, and nature as well. We spoke last week about the many different landscape styles and types you can find on Islay. Even though it's a small island, you have the west coast is completely different from the Kidalton coast, which again is different from the O. There are many, many different zones on Islay. So again, walking is the best way to discover those. So yeah, for sure. One thing just to come back to, Dolph, you called it a canal.
Yes.
Running down to Beaumore.
No canal.
That is that's definitely overstating the case. Huh? It's we're all familiar with canals from different places on Earth. There's the canal that runs, next to Niagara. There's the canals in Holland. All of these are wildly, wildly larger than anything you'll see between Bowmore's water source and the distillery. It's like a tiny little, much vegetated over creek.
A meter wide, more than that.
Occasionally less, but let's say call it a meter, and you won't be far out. Yeah,
more of a trickle.
So no canal whatsoever.
No,
and,
no canal. No,
okay, we're good. That's good.
It's yeah.
And Andrew, I wanted to mention, in Canada, we're very proud of our freshwater sources, right? And the beer companies and the whiskey companies all make a big, hullabaloo about our fancy schmancy water, like cool, clear water. And I asked one of the Scotch whiskey producers, I said, when it comes to the production of an alcoholic beverage, a lot of these other producers really draw attention to their water. I said, why isn't this done? Because I've never been to Scotland. Why isn't this done in Scotland? And he was very forthright. He said, because our water doesn't look good. It just doesn't look good. And I got that from your book. I totally understood what he meant after reading, your book.
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you a little anecdote there. Obviously, a lot of the water in Scotland is brown and peaty. And when I was a youngster, we had a family holiday in Scotland. There were I had two brothers, so there were 5 of us, and it took us a long while to get from our family home in Norfolk all the way to the Isle of Skye. We had to stop in Newcastle on the way, and long drives, and everybody was pretty exhausted by the end. And when we finally got to our accommodation on the Isle of Skye, it was time that us little boys went to bed. So my mum ran the bath, and my middle brother, Mick, saw this brown water coming out of the tap and just burst into tears. It was kind of completely the last straw, seeing all this apparently filthy water filling up the bath. So, yeah, we know exactly what he means, Val. We know exactly what he means.
I can't handle it. And I put a quote on what we did, because we did this one last week. And this was Douglas Murray of Diageo. On a scale of 1 to 100, I would rate the influence of water at between 1 and 2. And it's a great segue too, because this is going to give us the second thing we talked about. So page 72, another quote: every single dent and imperfection of the old still must be reproduced in the new still in order for it not risking altering the character of the spirit. According to Bill Lumsden, this was pure marketing bullshit. Stuart has a different view. What do you think, Andrew? And so we talked about that last week, but now we're coming up with a third one from Percy from Bowmore. And here was the quote that you have in your book, and it said, the peat, and you question, is it good stuff? And everyone argues about that one, he says. I don't think there's any difference whatsoever, to be truthful. So can you explain this just a little bit further, please? Because we've got 3 things now that we're casting light on, these 3 myths that we've all held dear because we've heard them so many times through marketing. Tell us about this one, please.
Okay, well, let's just, for anybody who wasn't watching last week, we'll briefly deal with the water one. The water, I think that the technical guys have it right. Remember that distilling is a process of water exclusion. So what the flavor that you're creating is essentially, obviously it's the product of the malt itself. It's also the product of distillation, incredibly importantly, which is a process of water exclusion. And then, of course, it's the product of the long aging that almost all whiskey undergoes. So those are the 3 major flavor contributors. And in particular with the malt, a question of whether it's peated or not. So that's mostly where the flavor comes from. And any kind of vegetative trace in the peaty water is really minor compared to those other factors. Then we go on to number 2, the shapes of the stills. Well, I think what Bill was referring to there is every single tiny dent or kink. Yeah, I mean, that's not so important. But I do think that if ever you update a still in a distillery, you will always try and reproduce in its broad outlines the shapes of the stills before. Although, as we're about to discover with Bowmore, those historically have changed significantly down the years. But if Bowmore was to be refitted out, let's say in the next 5 years, they would certainly try and reproduce in broad outline the shapes of the stills. That is quite important. And then, sorry, just the light's gone very bright somehow.
Yeah.
Just make me look a little less like a ghost. And then we come to the third element of this, which was what? Just remind me what the third
peat.
element is. The peat. Okay, of course, the peat. Absolutely. We talked about this. I talked about this a lot when I was researching the book. Remember that there have been times when the peat that's been used for Islay whiskies has come elsewhere from around the world. It hasn't always been cut from Islay. Sometimes it's come from Ireland. It can come from even further afield. I believe that, it's beyond question that the exact constitution of peat from different biotopes will be different. So peats from Ireland will be slightly different to peat from Islay, but the difference won't be significant. And when you're actually talking about the way you create the smoke with the peat and the way you put that through the malt and the way the malt is flavored by the smoke, that to me is the most significant factor of all. And the exact origin of the peat is I wouldn't say sentimental necessarily, but getting on for that. It's not of huge significance. Again, I have no reason to doubt what whiskey experts say. They're the ones who've worked with it all their lives, and they're the ones who researched it. And by and large, I trust them on that.
I'm pretty sure, though, most of us can tell, and I can tell the difference between a Highland peat and an Island or Islay peat. You can tell the medicinal compared to the heathery peat. So, but I think he's talking about being at that specific area just outside Bowmore is what I'm considering. Correct?
Yes, but I'm even quite surprised to hear you say with such confidence that you can tell the difference, Dolph. I'm wondering also, is it also a question of the way the peat smoke is actually pushed through the malt itself? The way it's fired. There are lots of other elements that could play a role too. I'm not saying it's not the case. I'm very interested to hear that you feel it might be the case, and that would be a good subject to research over a week or two by traveling to different different whiskey producing regions.
My wife does a nice blind, because I've got the black cup, so a nice blind tasting with these guys, and I can usually go between peat and peat. I'm having a hard time picking out one as opposed to the other sometimes, but a Benriach, I can tell a big difference between a Benriach and anything from Islay, because in my nose I do get a heathery peat. It feels more forest-like as opposed to medicinal. But I'm pretty sure I could be wrong. Like I'm sure someone out there could call me out on it, and it would be both.
Can I ask a question about stills to Andrew?
Sure.
Which distilleries, or do all of them, season a new still when it's installed? And by seasoning, because I remember when there was an Irish whiskey that seasoned their stills, and they claimed that they used juniper smoke to season the stills. And, you got to like juniper to be able to accept that in your head. Being somebody who's not fond of juniper, I looked at that and I thought, I can't ever drink that whiskey again. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, the first thing to say is that, a new still is not a frequent occurrence. It's
Fair
not,
enough.
Not happening every other month. It's the first I've ever heard about seasoning a still, but, and I'm very surprised to hear that one might season a still with a sort of herbal smoke. That seems extraordinary to me. To me, you want your still to be an effective piece of industrial kit, but you want it to be as pure as possible, as translucent as possible. You don't want the still actually to sort of flavor the spirit in any way. It's there to bring the spirit into being from your raw materials. But I'm very surprised to hear that it might actually be regarded as being a sort of a flavoring component of its own and might require seasoning with smoke. I'm very surprised to hear that. But I can't give you a good answer because I don't ever remember arriving at an Islay distillery where they just installed a new still, for example, and hearing about, how it was actually brought into operation.
Well, I won't name the Irish distillery that posted it on Twitter several years ago, and it lit up Twitter because nobody was expecting to see or hear that. And so I was just wondering if you had any experience.
Yeah. So not to mention that being a pot still, after you ran your first distillate through it, whatever smoke was in there would be gone just by the process alone.
You'd think most of it. Nick, you're going to say something?
There's a cool question on the side here I was going to throw to Andrew. He asks, this is from Russell, is there a universal rating system on the vegetative content or perhaps quality of peat used in the industry? I know that we all are used to seeing ppm rating how much after
quality. Yeah.
So yeah, but what about before? Like before you actually start smoking and putting the grain into the kiln, do we have a universal rating system? How do you tell good peat from not so good peat beyond basically the sogginess of it? If it's soggy, you're going to get a lot of good smoke. If it's too dry, you're just going to get heat and no smoke, and defeats the purpose.
Yeah. Good question, Nick.
Well, when I was researching the book, there was no universal assessment system. It was bought on knowing where it came from and knowing what that peat cutting would give you. In other words, a sort of
trial by error.
Yeah, the reputation that it already had and familiarity with it as a raw material, and then also on a visual assessment. But as far as I know, it never went off to the laboratories to actually analyze. Maybe that's changed now. We've got to remember that peat is becoming increasingly a sort of rare and contested resource.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of carbon locked up in peat bogs, and the more we cut peat away, the more we're going to release carbon. So it's actually a climate change issue. Anybody familiar with the sort of gardening industry will know that, there's a lot of bad stuff connected with selling peat composts. It's a very controversial area now. And that was even the case when I was researching the book. There was already, you remember that we come to this in the last episode of our discussion, but the Battle of Duich Moss, the environmentalists were very much against the widespread cutting of peat on Islay.
Yeah.
So that is also an issue too. Therefore, it may be that peat is now a much more valued resource than it was when I researched the book, and it may be that there is now a kind of protocol for assessing peat, but there wasn't when I wrote the book, and I don't know about it. So a good question.
It is. Thank you. And Nick, we could see why your black cat whiskey with the cat climbing up behind you. It's cute. It's adorable. Andrew, we're going to come back, and we're going to come back to I'll call it a canal, mini canal with John Murdoch. But when you read a bit about him, it relates less about the engineering feat and more about what I think the central theme developing in this book is, or just recognizing it, being the individual versus the establishment. So Murdoch is an excise man, so you think he's conservative, he's all about the money and the government, but he's also anti-aristocracy, and he's a socialist, he's a man of the people. Do you agree? And if so, when did this theme become apparent when you're writing, or did you have that theme in mind from the onset? A man of the people, or kind of pushing that agenda?
Yeah, well, you can't look at the history of the Highlands and the Islands in Scotland without considering questions of social justice. It's an extraordinarily moving story. We're going to talk about the clearances in a moment. But Islay is a very interesting test case in this respect. Murdoch was a fantastic fighter on behalf of let's say the oppressed landholders, the original people who were on the island. Remember, the island was very, very thickly populated in the 18th and 19th centuries, and gradually all of those people were dispossessed. And he was a very articulate and courageous and well-known at the time fighter on behalf of those people. That was why I made him one of the two dedicatees of the book. Good. Because he seems to me a thoroughly distinguished figure. But I don't want to turn it into a kind of a political thing. Actually, when we come to talk about the clearances, it's a very complex issue. It's a much more complex issue, in fact, than it's often been made out to be at various points. And there are, as always, arguments on both sides. But I think Murdoch was a very, he wasn't actually born on Islay, but he grew up on Islay. He was an intimate observer of Islay life through what I feel is its most moving period, this period of extraordinary social transition in the 19th century. And he wrote very well about it, and he campaigned for it. And, I find it inspiring to go back and read his writings.
And Andrew, to your point, as I read through the book, I realized too late that I should have started a family tree, because there are so many, right? Am I right?
Yes.
There are so many names, and some of them, it's almost like, are they using their surname and then their given name? Because you couldn't, I found it very, not through the writing, but just through how they were named. And one of the things I noticed on page 140 was you use the term moneyed grandee, and I'd never heard that term before. And I thought, is Andrew coming up with his own descriptors for these people? So that we know, that nowadays we can use the term influencers. Was it grandee like an influencer in those days?
Well, the moneyed grandees were the landlords, and the contrast between the wealth of the landlords and the dire, abject, miserable poverty of the people at the bottom of the heap out in the landscape, the cotters very often, was extraordinary. And this is even the case for the most sympathetic of the landlords. That's something, again, I think Dolph wants to talk about in a minute or two.
Yeah.
There were some very compassionate landlords, but at the same time, they were living lives sort of almost unimaginably more luxurious and removed from the lives of the people who over whom they had total control, in fact.
And I will interrupt just to kind of gear you on to that a little bit, because you described the progression of Islay's title from one aristocrat to the other, and in both positive and negative terms. It's not a socialist book. I think it's an underlying theme to it, and I'm looking for that probably because I'm a socialist guy. But could you, I noticed that the negatives do outweigh the positives. Maybe I'm blinded by my leanings, but is there an individual who stands out as having much more of a positive influence than a negative influence? And then after that, we will go to the clearances if you can, because I love that stuff.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the three most sympathetic of the lairds was Walter Campbell, the first Walter Campbell. That's we're back in the 18th century, 1777 to 1816, who was an extremely effective agricultural manager of the island. And obviously that meant that these were reasonably good times for the people living on the island, because he managed the island very well. He managed it better than his forebears had done. Then you have his son, Walter Frederick Campbell, 1816 to 1847, who was the final Campbell Laird of Islay, who was a much less effective manager of the island than Walter Campbell had been. But at the same time, he was an enormously compassionate man. He had very, strong feelings and sense of responsibility for the people under his care. He didn't extract rent from them in a cruel or remorseless manner. He wasn't a typical rack renting landlord by any means. And in fact, that eventually ruined him. The fact that he wasn't careful enough with the rents, and then terrible things happened and very difficult times, and it ended up with the potato famine, the Highland potato famine. And the island was dispossessed. He lost the island, and it passed out of his ownership at that point, because he'd been, in a way, such a compassionate landlord. And then the third key figure really is the figure who comes after that, John Ramsay, who was another extremely successful, extremely punctilious businessman who made an enormous success. He arrived on the island, to look into a distillery in which the family had an ownership. He became the distillery manager, and he built up a colossal fortune from there, actually. And he did wonderful good on the island. And he was also a very deep thinker. I mean, a lot of the removals from the island happened under Ramsay. But it wasn't something that Ramsay was trying to do. He wasn't throwing people off to make room for sheep, but he just saw that socially things had changed. There were agricultural challenges. The economic situation was completely different. And he could see that there actually was no future for so many people, for such a thickly populated island, and that really the best thing for everybody was, where possible, to move on to a new life elsewhere. So you can make an argument, I think, on both sides for his his morals, but I think in general, he was a very good manager of the island, and Isla could have done much worse than have somebody like that in charge during that particular period. So those would be the three figures I draw your attention to.
The three. Okay. And let's, I know I'm making you talk a lot. I'm sorry. But I do want to go on to the clearances. And Dave, you and I, you've been on this for the longest time with me, Dave, from the very beginning. We listened to this from a previous author about the clearances, and both you and I think, had the biggest we were most surprised that they did this. And I'm a history major, but that's Western Society, Canada, the States from, I don't know, 1640 something on. I really didn't hear about the clearances, Dave, either at this point, and the effect on the people. And we didn't really get that far with the previous author. And I'd like to go there with you, Andrew, if I can. So one, if you can go over the impetus, and you touched on it a little bit just now, if there was something else driving them to drive the people off the land. But two, what's the effect on the psyche right now? Like, is there still something that's palpable because of the clearance now, if I talk to the people on Isla?
These are all very, very interesting questions, Dolph. So thank you for asking them. Let me just paint a little picture before we talk about the subject in abstract, about, to try and imagine. I know Nick is the only one who's actually been to the island, but you've all read quite a lot about it by dint of having read this book, and I'm sure you've all seen images of it and so on. And I've spoken a lot about the kind of wilderness side of Isla. Well, if you go back to the 1740s, the 1750s, there were 170 different townships on Isla. Every township was between 2 and 20 families. So everywhere you looked, and in fact, there's a quote from Murdoch about this. Everywhere you look, everywhere on the island, you'll see little houses, miserable little houses very often, but you'll see them. People were up there, out on the hill. In 1830, Isla had a population of 15,000 people, and most of those were making a living off the land. Most of those were farming. They were farming run rigs, strip agriculture. Okay. The sort of agriculture that we normally think of as being, a feature of medieval life, but it was still very much a feature of the farming on Isla at that point. So 15,000 people in 1830. And many landlords all around Scotland couldn't get their rents in. Notably on Isla, you couldn't get the rents in. So the landlords weren't doing very well. And there was a feeling that the land wasn't being well used. And so the initial impetus for what we later came to call the clearances was to make agricultural improvements, to improve the yield from the land and ensure that the rents were better and the land was operating economically in a more efficient manner than it had before. And the way that was done, and this is a very weighty term to use, but it was enclosure. Now, anybody who's studied the history of agriculture will know that enclosure is a very significant term. The loss of the commons is a very significant term. And this was particularly true in the Hebrides, because, the Highlands, because the Highlands, the whole culture of the Highlands, the social structure of the Highlands was based on the clans. And that the principle of the clans, the social cohesion of the clans, was that you always had the right to common clan land. So the moment you began to enclose your land and change the sense, the way that the agricultural organization happened, at that point, the clan leaders, the lairds, originally being the clan leaders, became landlords. There was an economic transformation. And at that point, things began to change. And you had the arrival of the sheep, because it was thought that the most efficient use of that land was, in fact, not run rig strip agriculture to grow turnips and potatoes. And this became particularly the case after the potato famines of the middle part of the 19th century, but was actually to have sheep. So people were taken off the land to make room for sheep. This happened, and this is the most brutal side of the clearances, and they were moved off the land in order to have this new, more efficient form of agriculture. Was it more efficient? There are several opinions about that. You'll have seen some of those in the second of the history chapters, because there were some observations made by I forget the name of the chap, but the chap who arrived as a mine supervisor, and he felt that, in fact, the sheep weren't a very efficient use of the land, and that the farmers had been very good farmers if well looked after, and they should have been allowed to carry on cultivating the land as they used to be. But other people felt that use of the land was no longer sustainable, particularly, as I say, after the catastrophes of the potato famine. So initially, people were moved off the land, not entirely. They weren't thrown off the country. They weren't sent into exile as they later were, but they were encouraged to become kelp farmers. They were encouraged to become fishermen. They were encouraged to become mine workers. And this, for a while, this was thought to be a new way forward. So sheep on the hill, and the local people now working in fishing or kelp farming or mining. But all of these different industries, if we can call it that, activities, then underwent crises of their own in the first half of the 19th century. Kelp farming became completely uneconomical. The price of kelp collapsed. Fishing came and went. Sometimes there was fantastic herring off Islay, other times they disappeared completely. And mining, these were mostly fairly artisanal, small-scale mines, and the seams were quickly mined out, and that was that. So these weren't long-term solutions. Then you had the catastrophe of the potato blight and the famine that followed that. And after that, assisted passages became the way forward. Ramsay was, somebody who took a great interest in that. Many of the people from Islay went to Canada. Indeed, Canadian Gaelic was widely spoken for 2 centuries in Canada. Not much now, but that was certainly the case then. And Ramsay took enough interest to actually travel to Canada to see how people were getting on from Islay, the people who'd gone from Islay to Canada, and followed it all through. So yes, this tragic thing happened, and when you read some of the testimonies I quote in the book from the inquiry which happened in the 1890s on Islay into the clearances, it really was a bitter process. It was the parting of bone and marrow, as one of the observers says. It was shocking and traumatic for everybody, but it wasn't necessarily ever not going to happen. Perhaps it was a historical and economical inevitability. And if you speak to people on the island now, we'll just finish with that because you raised that as a final point. Well, you hear both. You hear different opinions. I quote James Brown, Farmer James Brown, a great friend of mine, wonderful chap. He says it was the best thing that ever happened to them. They went off, and in the end, they had much, much better lives in Canada or elsewhere than they ever could have expected. But at the same time, there is a great sense of historical injustice. And that does linger today because, land redistribution has still substantially not happened in the Highlands and the Islands. These are still areas where the vast bulk of the land is owned by lairds, often distant lairds, who very rarely go there. And I think when you come to the final chapter of the book, if you read the testimony from Margaret and Blair Rosger, who are exceptionally good farmers, Margaret runs one of Scotland's best B&Bs, enormously creative, high achievement individuals who feel nonetheless that the system has stymied them somewhat because they can never become the proper possessors of their land. And there is still that historical hangover. So yes, this is still a very, very live question in Scotland today. It's something still much discussed. And there have been several very famous books. Who owns Scotland? It's still a very, very live issue.
All right.
And even topical at the moment because of the troubles of Gupta, the steel magnate, who is one of those major Scottish lairds. How much sense does that make? I don't know. I'm sure many people in Scotland feel it doesn't make a lot of sense, but there will also be counter arguments to say that these are such difficult tracts of land that, in fact, the only people who can make sense and keep them in their best state are immensely wealthy individuals who don't need to make a living from them.
Okay.
And that was certainly the case when I talked to the McTaggart family on Islay and also talked to Bruno Schroeder on Islay. There is a strong case on that side of the argument too. It's not an easy argument to come down on one side or the other of.
So do we think that the clearances were profitable, better for the whiskey industry? Because we're going to bring this back to whiskey. Because let's say Bowmore, because Campbell the Younger threw up a town around Bowmore to develop the Bowmore distillery. Was it better for distilling, or was it better for industry as a whole? And was that the major focus, which I think it was, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, it wasn't a major focus. It's an agricultural focus. It was all about what is the best use of the best farming use of this land. What is the best economical use of the land? So in a way, whiskey is a little bit anecdotal to that, but it does also play a key role in the story. Because if you look at the century between about 1750 to 1850, one of the great curses of Highland rural life is the fact that so much barley was used for distilling. And there were many observers who felt that this was absolutely tragic. And I'm sure it was. I'm sure this was not got right. This was a complete fallibility in the system. And it was one reason in the end why probably it was a good thing that you had a legalization of distilling and that illegal distilling came to an end, because there's no question that, there were many periods of barley shortage on a rich barley growing island like Islay, because so much barley was being used for distilling purposes. And the distillers were able to manipulate barley prices, speculate, if you like, on the commodity of barley by buying at a low price at one point, and then there would be a shortage and they would still claim the barley that they'd already bought at that price earlier on. So, that was a tragic aspect of the enormous agricultural difficulties of the first half of the 19th century in the Highlands and Islands, and Islay was an example of that. So whiskey distilling did play probably a nefarious role in that part of the history.
Okay.
I have a question. I want to link this, okay? Because you're a wine guy. I noticed in your book you mentioned flavors from Viognier, and it's one of my favorite grapes. Okay, so the potato blight happened 1850-ish, right?
40s, 50s, yeah.
Yeah, and not long after that, the phylloxera happened in France, and that reduced the amount of wine that was able to be exported to Britain. Now, it's my understanding that as a result of that, the consumption of whiskey in Britain increased because there was no wine because of phylloxera. Now, if Islay had the chance, did they have the chance to understand economically what was happening between exports, between France and Scotch whiskey? And was Islay too much of an island upon itself to be able to, and I know this is an ugly word, but exploit the opportunity to send their whiskeys over to the Brits, who seriously were looking for options because wine was no longer available for a few decades?
Yeah, no, very good question, Val. Yes, this is really significant. This was hugely significant. If you were to log every single, I haven't done this, but somebody could, be a nice little project, a geeky project. Actual founding dates of every single existing malt whiskey distillery in Scotland, plus all of those that have disappeared that can be researched, you would find a very, very high percentage of them were founded in the 1870s and 1880s. And this was exactly why, because at that point it seemed like wine was dead, was finished. There would be no more wine. phylloxera, for 20 years, there was no cure. It was absolutely devastating. And vineyards were dying all over Europe. It was thought that perhaps, in California and in Chile and in Australia, they could take over the relay, but it was probably only a question of time before phylloxera arrived there as well. So these were wonderful, wonderful times for whiskey distillers. And many, many distilleries, including distilleries on Islay, were founded during those years. I haven't, again, actually checked of late. So, but, from rough memory, at least a couple of the Islay distilleries were founded in the 1880s, maybe 3. We can check that, later on. I can check it in the interval before we come back for the after dram. But, that was, so this did not go unnoticed on Islay. And it indeed, it wasn't just supplying the UK market, it was supplying the global market, because French wine had been exported all over the world, so had Italian wine, and suddenly suddenly all of that was under threat. And it was thought to be a wonderful, and brandy too, remember?
Right.
Brandy is still wine. So it also affected brandy. So end of brandy, end of wine, the future is a world in which everybody's going to be drinking Scotch. So these were halcyon days for Scotch whisky distillers. One person's misfortune is always another person's good fortune.
And good for us, as it is. Ladies and gentlemen, so we're quickly approaching the hour mark. Any last comments as we go around? So we'll do Nick, Kent, Dave, Val, Andrew. If you have any comments, we'll do that. And then everything else we're going to save for the after dram. Nick, last comment?
I was just wondering, just hearing about the clearances and looking at current discussions happening in society, is the whole aspect of clearances and what took place part of that whole colonization discussion that's happening right now and the effects of colonization?
And so think about that. That's another homework that you have, Mr. Jefford, but for the 10 minutes between the two sections.
I'm going to say that sounds like an hour show all in itself.
Okay.
I'm actually going to roll back to John Murdoch. A couple cool things. This took me down such a rabbit hole, and it was such a neat little research thing. But Murdoch is a nickname for a person associated with the sea. And the other thing is, now, how much you can believe this? I'm looking at John Murdoch, a teacher of roughly the same time, being friend and tutor to Robbie Burns, which is another sideway that I would like to see how that's all woven in.
All right. And so third thing for Andrew, sorry, we're giving him a lot of homework.
I've got no homework for you, Andrew. When I started this whiskey book club, it was just whiskey, and I enjoyed whiskey. But after listening to the history and reading the books and that, this is so much more. I mean, to sit down and enjoy a dram and think about what actually happened to get us to where we are today is absolutely amazing. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Dave. And Val.
I just found it interesting through the reading of the chapters for this session that whiskey at one point was an infused spirit, something that Kent had mentioned, that it was practically undrinkable. And I find it fascinating that nowadays you get a lot of the purists who don't fancy an infused spirit of any type. But what they don't realize is that at some point in history, there was infusions of flavors, and that was to make it palatable.
Excellent point. Thank you.
And absolutely true of wine as well. If you go back, wine's deepest history goes back. You can analyze the organic remains of ancient wine vessels and so on, and goes back about 9,000 years. And most of the residues we have from all of those ancient times, wine was always infused with other flavorings to make it more palatable. So this is something very common to all alcoholic beverages.
And we should keep that in mind. Well, Whiskey Brothers, Whiskey Sisters, that's the Whiskey Book Club this week. We're moving our conversation from this more formalized format to a more relaxed, equally engaging, possibly more colorful conversation. Author Andrew Jefford, this gentleman right up, I can do this right there, will of this Whiskey Island, a portrait of Islay and its whiskeys, will of course be joining us. And really, what better activity is there than talking about whiskey and spending time with fantastic people? So you should really join us. So we'll be back in 5 to 10 minutes on this channel for the After Dram. And if you don't want to miss a minute of this for the next 2 weeks, April 17th and 24th after that, with Andrew and us, click on the like, subscribe button, and we're going to see you soon. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a fantastic next 10 minutes and a fantastic afternoon if you're not with us. Ciao, everybody.